Hi, thanks for joining us tonight. I'd like to introduce Dr. Jacqueline Ashmore. She is the Executive Director of the Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy and a Research Associate Professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. She's a clean energy and sustainability expert with 15 years of experience in technology, business, and policy spheres. She is board president of New England Women in Energy and the Environment and a board member of the Northeast Clean Energy Council. She was awarded the American Physical Society's Andreas Akrivos Dissertation Award in Fluid Dynamics for her doctoral thesis. Please welcome Jacqueline Ashmore.
Therese, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here tonight and to get the chance to speak to all the people who will watch the recording and listen to the recording later. This is really such an important topic, and the title is Clean Energy Opportunity for Massachusetts and Beyond. But as I put this talk together, I was really thinking, what do I wish every single voter knew about sustainability? And so that was the way I shaped it in my mind. And I've got some slides that I'm going to share here, so hopefully everybody can see those now. Before I launch in, I really wanted to just talk about a little about what we do at the Institute for Sustainable Energy at BU. We are 4.5 years old, and I've been with the Institute for about 4 years now. And we really focus very heavily on interdisciplinary research. We have a whole swathe of incredible faculty, staff, and students across all of BU. And we'll work with anybody, whether they're in engineering or question school of business, school of public health, even theology. It's a really rich set of disciplines that people bring to the sustainability space and the sustainable energy space. We work a lot on policy analysis, and you'll see this unfold in what I talk about in the coming hour. Thinking a lot about climate mitigation, climate resilience, climate adaptation, and whether that's at a very local scale, right up to state level, regional, even global versions of the problem too. And one of the things that I think is really distinctive about the way that we work is we're not exclusively academically focused. We're really trying to figure out, how does our research get used by a utility, by a municipal leader, by a corporate leader, any number of external stakeholders? Almost all of our projects have a very direct relationship with somebody outside the university who says, here's my question, can you help me answer it? And I'd say for me, that's part of what I find profoundly rewarding, that we're not simply publishing papers that land in journals. We are providing information and analysis that people can then use to inform a different set of actions. Well, our work is very diverse and, as I say, spans any number of faculty members and their expertise across the university. We have established a few core research areas. One is sustainable cities, and I'll really be talking about that a lot this evening. New mobility is also very important. That's sometimes part of the cities challenge, of course. Rural mobility is also a different problem that's important. We put out a really interesting book called Melting the Ice, where ice is the internal combustion engine around EV infrastructure. So that's been one of our great accomplishments. Utility of the future, this is really around how do utilities transition to a whole new infrastructure, to managing that, even different underlying business models. And my boss, Peter Fox-Panner, just put out a really interesting book, Power After Carbon, which I recommend people consider. It's really intended for a broad audience and not just for specialists. And finally, we work on sustainable water management, recognizing there's a notable nexus between how we make our energy system sustainable and how we make our water system sustainable, and a big overlap. So we've worked a lot in that area, and I'll touch on one piece of that this evening. So turning to what brings this group together and this real interest in voting, I wanted to note before we launch into the talk that I feel like there's sort of an assumption that people who care about the environment are also people who tend to go and vote. And I'll admit that was sort of an assumption I had until somebody woke me up to the fact that actually a lot of environmentalists tend to stay at home when election time comes around. And so I mention this to this audience, not because I assume people here are unlikely to vote, but just to say, assume that you need to remind your friends who are environmentalists or acquaintances or colleagues, assume that it's helpful for you to remind them to vote. Obviously, November 3rd is coming up, and that is one big election, but also in local elections and any number of other important opportunities to influence who's making your decisions, who's making your policy. It's really important. And so I guess I urge you not just to vote yourself, but to evangelize voting. And hopefully that's going to make a difference and create a set of political leaders who are acting on the issues that we care about. So that's a preamble. I just wanted to give you all a bit of an outline so you know where we're going. I thought I'd start just by outlining big picture context, which includes some challenges, but then kind of zoom in. What are the federal actions? What are the state actions in the relevant spaces? And then finally get even more local around city level action. So really exploring all three of those layers. So starting with context and challenges, it was 2015 when COP21 was held in Paris, and amongst other things, there was this historic agreement based on the idea that we need to hold the global average temperature increase to well below 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. And I feel like for all that much has happened since then, and some of it really hasn't worked well at all in terms of supporting that goal. In fact, some of it has taken us very much in the opposite direction, unfortunately. That still remains a touchstone for people. And so I think it's important to kind of hold on to that. And I guess thinking about the beginning of 2020, which also still feels like a long time ago now, given it's been an historic 7 months. At the beginning of 2020, it was a new decade. And part of the framing around our work on energy and environment was this is a critical decade in achieving that goal. So many things are framed in terms of a 2050 goal, but really everybody knew, and everybody in the world of energy and the environment was so focused on these next 10 years have to involve massive change for us to have a shot at reaching that ultimate goal. And so that was a rallying cry that we were all acting on. And of course, I just want to acknowledge the moment we're in now. Here we are, the beginning of August 2020, and so much has hit us. So this was on the left, the graph of GDP from the New York Times that came out last week as I put this talk together. You'll see it spans 1950 to today. And obviously that's dramatic. So that's the economy. And unfortunately, that's only part of the story around a vast public health crisis that's consumed the world and really turned our lives upside down. Then in addition, with George Floyd's murder on May 27th, and then several other egregious violations of racial justice and other killings, we all woke up to another whole challenge that for many of us has not been in our face every day, but for a substantial fraction of our population is in their face every day. So this is just really hard to just process, right? And it's really hard to go from, okay, there's all this grief for so many different reasons, whether it's racial, health, economic, any number of sources. There's all this trauma that we're seeing right now. And how do you move from that to figuring out how you start to address some of these issues? It, to me, occasionally can feel somewhat paralyzing. People who have comparable roles and ambitions to help affect change. Back in late March, I just thought, you know, maybe people don't even want to think about climate. Maybe everybody's focused on public health and on, you know, more recently on Black Lives Matter. And those are, of course, just massive priorities for our day. And maybe people are going to feel that climate and energy have to go on the back burner for a while, even though, you know, what we've seen in terms of devastation and death from COVID-19 is really just kind of a glimpse of what climate change may bring if it goes unchecked. And then the racial suffering is also a part of what we see with climate catastrophes that result from fossil fuel-based energy systems. So I kind of wondered where it was going to go. And I guess what's really fascinating is when you look at polls that have been conducted recently, people remain very supportive of action to address climate change. And our institute is actually in the depths of a project now. We'll release a report in September, focusing specifically on, there are cities in the US that had climate action plans before this all hit, and how are they responding to either continue to advance their climate action plans or to modify them, acknowledging that, you know, they may want to take much more account of equity and climate justice and environmental justice, or are they so overwhelmed and experiencing such big budget challenges as a result of COVID, is that leading them to pull back on their climate change? And of course, there isn't one simple story, but what we see is many cities continuing to press forward on their climate action plans, continuing to prioritize that, and morphing towards more of a climate justice emphasis and figuring out how can that move forward. And so I created this slide around fundamental connections to say, I think it's not just people who've worked deeply in any one of these fields that see the incredible connectivity between public health, between anti-racism, between governance, economic security, climate and energy, and environment and sustainability. I think there's a broader awareness that you can't be acting on one in isolation as effectively as if you're understanding that they all have intersecting aspects, and the effect of one has an effect in one of the other spheres too. So in that sense, you know, while we're in this time of turbulence and hardship and, you know, just immense challenges, I actually think there is room for incredible hope. And I guess that's something that I really wanted to emphasize to you all. Of course, in this virtual format, it's hard to see what's the energy that people are bringing to this discussion, and, you know, are they feeling despondent, or but if you are feeling like, wow, this is just a really tough spot, I'd say I hope that the depth of disruption, I think, creates an opportunity for us to rethink, reimagine, and really try and build solutions that are addressing several of these issues, these challenges at once. So that's my hope. Now, kind of just continuing the COVID angle and just how that relates to some of these other issues. Maura Healey, the Massachusetts Attorney General, commissioned a study looking at what are the differential impacts on a fine geographic scale, i.e. in different cities in Massachusetts. And so this plot that you see here has on the vertical axis people of color as a share of the population. And then the horizontal axis is COVID-19 positives per 10,000 people. And so I believe this came out in May. So of course there is new data that could be added here. But what you do see is, unfortunately, a correlation between if you have more people of color in your population, you have typically a higher number of COVID-19 positives in your population also. And I think, well, this is just one study. This has been reinforced by a lot of the literature. And there are many, many reasons for that, right? And I'm sure you've all been reading your share of news articles. And certainly we can't just go to one simple reason. But given that this talk is about clean energy and about the environment, I wanted to just share another study that came out in 2019 from the Union of Concerned Scientists. They do a lot of great analysis of different environmental and energy issues, amongst other topics. And so what you see here is the vertical axis is about how much are people exposed to fine particulate matter. And so this is part of what gets released when you combust fossil fuels, whether it's gas in your car or any other kind of combustion. And so what you see on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, is a breakdown according to different racial groups. And so, unfortunately, you've got Asian Americans and African Americans both seeing around about 25% higher than the average exposure to fine particulate matter. And then over on the extreme right-hand end, you've got the white population typically at about sort of 7% or so lower than average. So, this is kind of part of the story. And so how do we kind of connect these two together? Well, if you're constantly breathing polluted air, then you're much more likely to develop asthma. And as we know, if you have asthma or other underlying conditions, then you're much more likely to succumb to COVID-19. So these are some of the sort of underlying challenges in the context of COVID. And I just wanted to talk a little more about a couple of other challenges. So we mentioned how the economy is a piece of this too. And one of the things that I think is shocking is what percentage of the income that low-income households can be spending on energy. So this is a somewhat old report. I really dug around to try and find one that was more up to date. This is from 2016 from ACEEE. But while I couldn't find a better graphic that was more up to date, what I found digging through is that this general information continues to remain valid, even though some of the detailed numbers may have changed a little. But again, what you're seeing here, when you have the breakdown with the African Americans and Latinos, those people are typically paying a high fraction of their income on energy. And so again, you've got lots of things that are getting reinforced here. Unfortunately, the tendency in the absence of specific action to prevent this, the tendency is for low-income housing to often not be very energy efficient. then those households, they're spending so much on energy, it's really difficult for them to save up for more energy efficient devices. And so again, you've got this whole downward spiral that tends to place a burden disproportionately on people of color. And so these are the kind of things we really need to be thoughtful about addressing. And if you're starting to feel like this is the bad news section, it is, but we're going to get into some of the solutions and the hope a little later. So hang in there. So finally, I just wanted to talk about another aspect. This is more environmental than energy, but as we've recognized, that all ties together in certain ways. So I've been working with a team from the School of Public Health at BU on water quality in the Merrimack Valley. And I imagine many of you know the local geography, but basically the Merrimack Valley starts in New Hampshire and then flows along the border just south of the Massachusetts-New Hampshire border out to the Atlantic. And so you've got a number of communities here where you've got wastewater treatment plants and you've got sewer systems which are set up so that when you have a heavy rainfall, you essentially have a sewer overflow. And what that means is that raw sewage flows into the Merrimack River. Now, obviously, that's problematic in general. You've got a lot of people who are recreating on the river and can be exposed. Right now, there's no system to notify people of these discharges. Even worse, our research got started when we found a paper that noted if you looked at occasions when there are heavy rainfall and the number of people admitted to local emergency rooms with gastrointestinal conditions in the days after that, you saw a spike in those GI cases after these heavy rainfall events that correlated, no doubt, with combined sewer overflows. So you've got several communities who are drawing their drinking water from this river. A number of them are environmental justice communities where you've got a high percentage of people of color or people who don't speak English as a first language. And you know, it is a substantial public health problem. And so that's something that we're working to address. And a challenge we felt was truly unacceptable, given here we are in the developed world and in a state where so much is possible in general. It felt like we should be part of the team trying to address that. So that was an outline of some of the things that we might want to think about how we fix. And you know, some of that, of course, is through voting, whether that's at the federal level, the state level, or even at a more local level. So next we'll turn to just a discussion of you know, what's going on at the federal level and what's going on in some different states, how much is happening. And obviously, any one of these subsections could be an entire talk in itself because there's so much. One thing, this doesn't actually tie in quite so directly with the political sphere, but again, just to put a little bit of a brighter context out there, it was in around about June, I wrote an article that was looking at how big do we think the effect of COVID-19 on clean energy will be on a longer time frame. You know, 2020 is clearly an exceptional year where it is incredibly hard to make forecasts. There's still a lot of uncertainty, maybe less now about 2020 than there was 2 or 3 months ago. But still, forecasting for this year is really quite complicated. But clearly the forecasts on any number of fronts, unfortunately, won't be good. However, what I was really interested to find is that as I dug through various analyses that have been turned around quite quickly in May and June, so kind of after the first shock had kind of gone through the system. In May and June, people looking at what projects were being approved, what are utilities announcing, what's getting financed in the clean energy space, was really looking quite positive for 2021 and beyond. And while not sustaining the original forecasts from before COVID for 2021, just often taking fairly small reductions in forecasts for the increase in renewable energy and storage and any number of things any number of metrics you might use to measure how's clean energy doing in this space. I'll also note, I mean, here we are, in addition to the COVID disruptions, which affected supply chain, they affected energy demand. We also had the geopolitical shock that sent oil prices negative briefly early in the COVID era. And so while, big picture, the global electricity demand shrank in that first 6 months of 2020, if you look at the renewable generation, that actually increased. And again, this is a little outside the primary kind of political lens, but really this is just showing how strong the markets are, how strong the economics are. Also, in some cases, what tipped the balance in getting a project approved was communities rising up and saying, I'm sorry, we don't want another gas peaker in our community, and we don't want another fossil fuel generation source. We want a different approach. And so all these forces are coming together to sustain a positive story for clean energy. Now, of course, I mean, this keeps unfolding week by week and month by month, and there are no guarantees that these forecasts will hold. But I just wanted people to know that even with the level of shock and turmoil we've experienced so far, there is a possibility that we could pull out of this in 2021 and still have some good news next year and moving forward. So if we're lucky, this will be kind of a 1 year anomaly. And obviously we all have to be part of the daily, our daily behaviors have to help our communities move forward in that way, all being well. So digging now a little more into the federal reaction. So, of course, one could say any number of things about this. I'll just kind of keep it relatively brief. The stimulus efforts we've seen to date have benefited the fossil fuel industry and have not benefited the clean energy economy. So that's the current administration's approach. What is really quite heartening is to see how many meaty proposals the Democrats are putting on the table. The Green Act, the Invest Act, the Climate Crisis Action Plan, and then quite recently, Biden's $2 trillion action plan for climate change and environmental justice. I actually personally feel that, I get it, there's a lot going on in the news, but I felt that Biden's plan did not get the level of coverage I would have hoped and maybe even expected, because this is a big deal. He has really been bold in his thinking and is really looking to create a whole suite of actions on all number of fronts, recognizing that, with that level of investment, you generate a lot of good quality jobs. Also recognizing those jobs go across the country to red states and to blue states. And so I really hope that we can maintain that course for optimism. As we all know, plans get watered down in the political process, and this is only the starting point. But nonetheless, for the starting point to be so ambitious, I think is a real source for hope. And so this is just a reminder of how important voter turnout will be in November, amongst other things. So that's at the federal level. Now, I just kind of cherry picked a few aspects of what some states are doing as well. And sorry, there are quite a lot of words on this slide. But even at the state level, there continues to be a lot of forward momentum. New York, $10.6 million, helping disadvantaged and environmental justice communities to access solar power. And then $573 million for the New York Sun program, looking to install 6,000 megawatts of distributed solar by 2025, and almost a third of that serving socially vulnerable communities. So that was one notable headline. California, this is maybe a little harder to assess what the impact will be, but it's certainly a notable change that they're working to resolve this limitation on building new utility scale solar. One of the things that can sometimes get a little lost in general media coverage is that home rooftop solar is fantastic. That's a great thing to have. But really, a lot of the scale here can come from utility scale solar, and that can really move the needle on clean energy much more rapidly. Massachusetts also pushing hard on solar. We have this SMART program, and there was a real effort to ensure that we increase the capacity of the solar projects that could benefit from that program up to 3.2 gigawatts. So this happened to be solar focused. At the same time, we're seeing amazing changes in offshore wind. It's one of those things where the US is late to the game for any number of reasons, but now everything is really starting to advance rapidly up and down the Northeast coastline. A large number of projects really starting to move forward and move forward quite quickly. So that's another area. And then the paper I wrote also looked a good amount at storage and how that's moving forward. That's an area where the price challenges can still be present at some scales, but nonetheless, there are some big storage projects that have also been approved recently. And so with any number of technologies and approaches, there's some really upbeat stories, even in this era when we're challenged to deal with so many different difficulties simultaneously. I also wanted to touch on the Transportation Climate Initiative. And for context here, some of you may have heard of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, commonly referred to as RGGI. This is basically a cap and trade scheme on our electricity in a number of northeastern states, well established now and by many measures quite successful in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions associated with electricity generation in particular. And so essentially, over the last couple of years, there's been this growing movement with these 12 states from the Northeast, including Massachusetts, of course, and the Mid-Atlantic region as well as the District of Columbia, to say, can we create something similar to address our transportation emissions? As noted here in the graph, transportation is about 40% of our emissions. So if there's a way to reduce that substantially, then that really has a big overall impact. And there are various different aspects of this Transportation Climate Initiative, but one of them is noted in that second bullet point around how can we cap and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from the combustion of gasoline and on-road diesel fuel by up to 25% compared to 2022 levels over 10 years. And so I guess just kind of link together different terminology that people may have come across. This is one way to put a price on carbon in a certain realm of our use. And so just wanted to kind of pull that terminology in to help people connect dots. And, you know, as noted around the level of exposure that people of different ethnicities and races have to emissions and to fine particulate matter, this really has potential to benefit public health in a number of ways. And, you know, the reality is, the economics, of course, really, really matter. And so I think there's a lot of careful study going on to kind of link with these measures, what will the public health benefits be economically, and what's the reduction in costs that we could potentially see. So this initiative is still being shaped, and so this initial analysis was based on, of course, a certain set of assumptions, but you're potentially looking at savings of up to $10 billion by 2032. And, you know, while that number, it's a good one to have, there's also, of course, the fact that you can't truly put a price on human life and human health. So that's kind of the bigger piece of the conversation too, that will always be purely qualitative, realistically. So just one more example that I wanted to touch on, given we'll talk a little bit about buildings, and this ties in a little with that energy burden that I was talking about earlier in the discussion, and how these low-income households are sometimes spending a considerable amount of their income on energy. So Connecticut is working to make new buildings 15% more energy efficient, and they do that through what's called a stretch code. So there are established building codes, and then you know, people have realized that one opportunity to layer something on top of those to help generate better energy efficiency and reduce emissions. One approach is to create these so-called stretch building codes. And you know, Connecticut is not the first to look at this. There are other versions in other states. I just picked this one because it's current. And so they're looking at this as something that can support the state level goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030. So this actually opens up a really interesting discussion. If you follow how the political debate is unfolding, there is some pushback, both from developers, but also from some people who advocate for affordable housing, who say, what will the effect be on affordable housing? This is clearly intended to benefit all housing, but especially affordable housing, in making it less expensive for those occupants to pay for the energy that they need, because they're using less of it. However, the concern is it may make the building of that affordable housing more expensive, and so maybe counterproductive in that sense. So I had a fun time picking through, like, is there solid evidence one way or the other? It seems that it's fair to say comparable policies in other states haven't increased the effect of affordable housing. And in addition, in Connecticut specifically, this stretch code is actually consistent with what are already existing standards for state-funded affordable housing. So I think there's room to be optimistic there that this wouldn't turn out to be an unintentional burden on affordable housing and the community that needs that. But I think it's also worth just flagging the complexity and, unfortunately, sometimes the unintended consequences of people really trying to do the right thing. And sometimes we look back and say, wow, that didn't turn out the way we hoped. And so that's one of the challenges here. So I guess just making sure that the people we look at electing in are really thoughtful and really responsive to data, and pulling in studies based on other states or other countries, whatever is relevant. That seems like another really important piece to consider. So moving on now, I'd like to dig in a little more on the city level as the third section. This, as I indicated, is an area where ISC has done a lot of work to date. And I guess I just wanted to start by kind of framing a way to think about the overall set of issues that cities need to act on in this space. So you've got climate change mitigation, which is saying we typically, and even now in the shutdown mode, we engage in so many activities that emit greenhouse gases, whether it's heating or using air conditioning in our buildings, whether it's our home or our office space when we're able to work from it, whether it's our transportation, whether it's the waste and emissions that come from that. Here we tend to just put our trash out and put our recycling out, and then somebody picks it up and we don't think about it any further, right? But that goes and gets treated or doesn't get treated. It gets incinerated or it goes into landfill. There are all those activities that generate emissions, and increasingly cities as well as states are defining here are our mitigation goals and being very targeted in those and very analytical in how do we pursue those. So that's one area. There's also climate change adaptation and resilience. So that's appreciating that we are likely to have more intense precipitation. We already have more intense precipitation. It will grow yet more intense. There will be more intense drought in other places. Some places will have both more intense precipitation and more intense drought at different times. Coastal cities like Boston and New York will grapple ever more with sea level rise. Wildfires in California, higher summer temperatures. There are all these changes which, even if we mitigate incredibly well, incredibly quickly, there's still a lag in how the actual effects in our environment play out, a time lag. And so we have to prepare for these and be ready for them. And that's a critical city function, of course. And then I just wanted to flag something broader that I'm terming sustainability here, and that's the focus on public health. It's about ensuring people have good air and good water quality. It's about thinking about how can we make sure people get good quality green jobs as we grow the clean energy economy. It's about, do people have a green space where they can get out and where their kids can play safely and they can just enjoy without necessarily needing to drive to a park. So there's that whole space too. And this is just within the context of sustainability. Of course, we all know cities have any number of priorities that are considerable and always juggling for attention and for resources. So I thought I'd just touch on two city plans. I'm actually mainly going to dig into Boston since that was the one that our team worked on. I guess I referenced earlier this research we're doing around how are cities responding to COVID? How are they thinking about their climate action work in the context of COVID? And I think one plan that showed a lot of foresight came out of Providence in 2019 and was phrased as a climate justice plan. And I think we're definitely seeing a lot of movement towards thinking about climate justice at a city level. And I think that's both recognizing that we've really seen highlighted the extra burdens that people of color bear, both health-wise and in the climate space. It also, if cities have more limited resources, then finding ways to kind of integrate plans means you might be able to accomplish more with the same level of resources. And so I think that's a practical piece of it too. So I'll speak to our Carbon Free Boston report. One of the things I just wanted to flag with this slide is that the equity considerations were really integrated into this study in a really profound way, and in a way that was hadn't really been done by other cities previously. We produced several reports. I think our brief summary report is a mere 120 pages, and then you can dig down in more detail in other reports. I guess we decided to additionally separate out the social equity work to make sure there was a spotlight put on it, but that is not intended to take away from the fact that it was really embedded at every point in the process, and it wasn't an add-on at the end, which is really important. So the one other thing I'll just state is, so the city of Boston has set a goal of being carbon neutral by 2050. That is, I remember when I shared that with people shortly after it was announced, I felt like there were two reactions. One reaction was, oh my goodness, that's not nearly soon enough. They have to really work harder than that. And then the other reaction was, that sounds impossible. How can they possibly pull that off? So, setting these goals is a really tricky process. But I think, it is, it's a giant goal. It will not be straightforward to pull off, but to set those tough goals and then to really work hard on figuring out how do we get there. I really credit all the people who have the courage to do that, and then put in a lot of hard work to figure it out. So very broadly, there are sort of 4 strategies that all need to be pursued to achieve this mitigation. So one is you want to reduce the demand for energy and maximize the energy efficiency. If you just allow energy demand to grow organically and don't take measures to address that, then it's going to be such a huge demand that you're really going to struggle to supply enough clean energy. Electrification is incredibly important too, and obviously that can play a big role in transportation with cars, but also in homes and buildings. Then, having taken those 2 steps, you want to move to greenhouse gas-free fuels and electricity. And all of this, as I say, has to be built with this framework of what are the social outcomes, how do we act in an intentional way. So we'll go through 4 different sectors here. We'll talk through transportation, buildings, waste, and then clean energy. And then we'll just have a couple of wrap-up thoughts after that. But just to talk you through this graph, this is a format that's going to pop up on the following slides as well. So we'll just take a minute to understand it. So that orange bar on the left is showing the greenhouse gas emissions for transportation in 2016. And then the next bar shows what's the new baseline that we would start to think about in 2050 if we just allow, general actions to unfold. If we allow vehicle efficiency to improve, then we've got a reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions, which is pretty substantial. So that kind of goes a long way to reducing emissions. Now you've got smart mobility, and of course, I mean, how much we go back to Lyft and Uber once we have a vaccine for COVID-19 remains to be seen. But at the time, pre-COVID, the analysis that the ISE team did quantified the greenhouse gas emissions increases that were likely to be associated with that. On the other hand, I guess I'll just note on that unmanaged smart mobility, you've got a plus 51 above it because it increases emissions. And then on the others, it's all minus because they reduce emissions. The active measures you're looking at to reduce emissions include focusing on transit as you grow your city, grow your transportation network. There are various aspects of pricing that inevitably play into this. Do you want to consider a congestion pricing scheme or anything like that? That's been done in London, of course, as well as some other cities. And then once you kind of moved towards getting people biking and walking and using public transportation as much as you can, moving people to electric vehicles where they do have to drive, then the next step is making sure that that electricity that is supplying those EVs is green. And so you've got both the 80% clean grid case there and then the 100% clean grid there. And then finally, in every case, you have some residual emissions that it just is exceedingly challenging to reduce. And that ultimately is where offsets come in at the end of the game. I wasn't planning to talk too much about that this evening, but just acknowledging that there's that piece too. Then we have building emissions, and so a similar format to the plot here, showing the greenhouse gas emissions in 2015 in this case. One of the things that is incredibly challenging about buildings is that addressing our building emissions will involve a considerable amount of retrofits. Even in a growing city, the number of new buildings is pretty limited. So even if you are incredibly aggressive and say, we are going to make these buildings energy neutral, you still have to do a lot of work on your existing building stock. And that's disruptive and complicated, and I really think this is what we see as the biggest challenge in this overall space. So again, you're driving towards energy efficiency, you're looking at those deep energy retrofits, and so you've got those reflected in that second blue bar with the -2.5 underneath it. And then finally, after electrification, you're looking again at make that electricity clean, and then you're really driving down your emissions substantially. A third key area is the emissions from waste. And so really the goal here is by 2050 to be diverting 90% of the waste. And again, a tall order, but there are various measures that can be taken to address that. So here you've got a little organic growth in waste between 2017 and 2050, reflecting population growth amongst other things. And you'll see plastic recycling is key here in driving substantial reductions. You want to divert other materials, electronics, tires, textiles. And then source reduction is just trying to ensure that a number of things don't even enter the waste stream to begin with. Obviously, here we are today in the COVID area using more plastic bags, more paper bags. We are into a newly material intensive and correspondingly, unfortunately, high waste mode. But hopefully, we will find a way to pull back on that and achieve the kinds of reductions that we're looking at here. So then the fourth area is all about how to source that clean energy. So these three graphs are a little different in format, so let's take a minute to sort through them. So on the left-hand side, you've got the baseline demand. You've got both electricity in orange and natural gas in blue. Then the middle one shows if you simply electrify, then what happens? And so you see your electricity demand has increased and your natural gas demand has decreased. And then the third one shows if you introduce not just electrification, but in addition, efficiency and demand reduction, then where do you end up with in terms of your needs, both on electricity and on natural gas? And they're both somewhat lower. So there are various approaches to address how do we make those energy needs, how do we supply that energy in a clean way. There's the solar PV, and we touched on rooftop already. There are district energy systems. And then there are various ways to procure clean electricity. I wasn't planning to get into detail on this, but you can look up these if you're interested. You've got renewable energy credits, you've got power purchase agreements, and those power purchase agreements can either be local or in some cases can be virtual. BU now has a virtual PPA with the source in South Dakota. And then finally, there are many developments in the area of renewable fuels and a lot of opportunity and a lot of complexity as well, whether you're looking at liquid biofuels, renewable natural gas, biomass or hydrogen from renewable electricity. So much developing there, and I think it's sort of hard to see exactly where it's heading, but there are clearly some interesting opportunities there. So we've mentioned equity a little bit. I just wanted to touch on the framework that the ISE team, which I should say was led by Professor Cutler-Cleveland, they built this framework around equity questions into all aspects of their study. And so for all four of those areas that I just talked through, transportation, buildings, waste, and energy, every measure that was put forward was evaluated around, is it green, with those three sub-questions listed there, is it fair, and finally, who gets to decide? And I think that's one of the pieces that's really important. It's not simply about what your endpoint is in a decision-making process, but also like who's involved in getting you there and who are the voices at the table. So that's a really critical piece too. I just wanted to end with one thought for this group, which is voting alone is fantastic, really important, but it is not enough on its own. I guess I wanted to look back at this moment to that example around the Merrimack River. And what we're seeing there is a group of stakeholders coming together and talking really intensively about what are the problems, what do we understand, what don't we understand, what do we need to learn in order to frame good solutions, and then how do we pursue those. And in this case, it's a group of municipal leaders, of policymakers, of community groups, of business owners and researchers like the BU team, as well as a researcher from Tufts. And I'll add, the media has really played an important role in ensuring that the water quality problems are understood there. The Boston Globe ran an article at a critical point several months ago, and the response to the media was so rapid and so strong that it changed the outcome in a permitting process. So what we're seeing in this example, as well as in countless others, is just, it really matters to stay engaged beyond the ballot box. And I'll just cite one example that's really just from Friday. There's a bill that would require notification of occasions when sewage is released into the Merrimack River. So this means people who might choose to recreate can kind of be aware and, presumably choose not to recreate when those notifications come through. And similarly, it can just build more understanding of what are the impacts of those sewage releases and enable advancement towards a solution. So, Friday, the word came out, we need to call our state senators to get that bill advanced. And there was a great response, and fingers crossed it's enough to get the bill voted on in the Senate. But I just cite that as one example of really, we make progress when we all engage in a continuous way and not every 4 years when there's a presidential election, or every 2 years. The more we can all weave some level of effort on a challenge that we care about into our lives, the better. And the more we can reach out to other constituents and try and find people who may be experiencing much bigger burdens from some of these challenges and include them in the process. That's really significant too. So that was what I prepared, and I hope it's been interesting. And Therese, I'm really looking forward to discussing all this with you.
Fabulous.
I will hop out of screen sharing mode now.
Okay, that was very interesting. And I've got a bunch of questions here, but the Merrimack Valley, is there not another way for the companies or the communities that are releasing sewage into the river? Is that another way for them to dispose of that?
It's not straightforward, right? I mean, this is about infrastructure that was put in place in many American cities decades ago. And I should say that, there is, the EPA is involved. There's an understanding that these places need to come into compliance and be reducing their discharges. I think the difficulty is that it's a process that tends to move very slowly. And so there is a sort of solution map in place, but it will take a long time to actually reach completion. This is one part of the solution is to really make considerable infrastructure changes, and that costs a lot of money. And in fact, Manchester in New Hampshire is taking some big steps with a massive amount of funding to address part of this. So there is some progress on that front. One of the interesting questions to ask is, what are the other solutions that can help even just partially on a more rapid timescale? So for example, one of the questions you can ask is, could green infrastructure be effective? And green infrastructure is a vast set of sub-solutions. It's not kind of a cookie cutter approach. And there are many green infrastructure stories that are big success stories. And there are some where the outcomes are more complicated. So you really have to kind of understand what's the exact challenge that we're experiencing and what are the green infrastructure possibilities. Where green infrastructure does work well, it can have the side effect of providing some great green jobs for maintenance of that green infrastructure, and it can be a great source of employment. But you really have to kind of understand a lot about the specifics to kind of figure out, does that make sense to invest in that too on a shorter time scale?
Okay. I thought it was interesting you said about the communities rising up and making their voices heard and making themselves visible,
right,
outside of the polling places.
Mm-hmm.
So is so important and so successful.
Right.
So this would this strategy would certainly work in a number of scenarios around energy and how our communities are, whether or not they're doing what they need to do. And I mean, like as you just said, the big monetary investment to change old systems. I mean, it needs to be done.
Right.
So what other? I mean, you said the press is doing a really good job of educating the communities about what specifically is going on, making it very understandable so that they can be active and make smart decisions. Are there?
And one of the other mechanisms I just point to here in New England is the town meeting system is amazing. And I personally find it really interesting, having grown up in the UK where there's nothing comparable. But the opportunities to change things at a town level through your town meeting is really fascinating. In the town I live in, I served on town meeting for a while, and we've lived here for 12 years. And I've really seen the town, they too have set an emissions reduction target, and they too are studying, like, what are the dominant sources of our emissions? How could we change that? And, that's, in fairness, the town leadership is very strong. But in addition, people show up to town meeting, either the formal process or sub meetings, and they let our leadership know, like, this matters to us and we want you to be paying attention. And it really is this kind of ongoing dialogue.
And members of the community are willing to serve on these committees, the
Right.
zoning,
Absolutely.
planning board, whatever it be.
Absolutely. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Well, that's a wonderful thing. It's a big commitment of time and energy to do.
I mean, that's the hard thing, right? Everybody has their work and families and any number of other things in their life. But it's one of those things, if we can all find a little piece that we can take on and find ways to collaborate, we can kind of carry the load collectively and can make progress as a team. So that's the ideal. And I'm not saying it's easy, but maybe something to aspire to.
Right. One of your slides that showed capping and reducing carbon dioxide pollution. How, could you give me some examples of how that would happen?
Yeah, I mean, underlying that is you need to have a reporting mechanism of what people are emitting, and then you need to have a process that allocates caps on some set of criteria, and then beyond that, you then get into kind of a trading scheme of if I have my cap and I know I'm going to exceed it, well, I might buy some credit for a cap from somebody else who isn't going to meet their cap. So there's an economic underpinning to that, which it takes a lot of process to set up, but it is successful when you do. This is partly why we don't have a price on carbon more broadly yet, because it is supremely complicated. And I think, unfortunately, there's always a sense of many people feel like they would be losers in that situation, and relatively few people feel like they would be winners. So that's why I think it's one of the reasons I think it's very hard to build political will to put a price on carbon in general. But we're seeing people kind of break off little pieces and work on subsystems where you can set that up. Interesting. And it all adds up, right? Every area we're reducing emissions, it all contributes to our overall reduction.
Let's see. Oh, we saw how going to zero when we first shut down, and we could see images of the Grand Canal in Venice and dolphins, and apartments in India where they had been living in their apartments in smog, and suddenly they could see sunrises and sunsets and stars, things they had never seen.
Yeah.
So we know that how quickly, when you shut it down completely, how quickly the earth recovers.
Right.
But now that we're getting back to the way we're used to living, how difficult do you think this is going to be to convince people to, or get them to remember that brief time when the air was clean and the water was clean?
Yeah.
That now this is how we can progress to do better.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think in this overall challenge we have in reducing our emissions, we have great technology. We might want some of those technologies to be cheaper or more flexible, or we might want some of the parameters to change, but we have a lot of technology. And I think the really hard piece is adoption and behavior change. And unfortunately, I think we know our attention span is very short. And so I'm unfortunately not highly optimistic that we're going to say, hey, remember early April, that was golden. Like, how do we replicate that? And I mean, in a way, I say, unfortunately, I think our attention span is too short. At the same time, like, that was a level of drastic action that's not sustainable, right? I mean, we can't be shutting down our countries, shutting down a big fraction of the world in order to reduce our emissions. We have to find other ways to continue to engage once public health allows, that still maintain low emissions. And that's actually a piece of my institute's research this summer around where there are gains, what are the opportunities to maintain them, and where there have been losses, how do we make sure we reverse that? One of the big areas being, like, people will probably find it quite hard to get back on public transportation, but emissions wise, that's one of the best things we can do. There was a New York Times article I saw earlier today that was arguing it's probably safer than you think, but still I think our psychology will be to fear that level of enclosure and potential crowding. So I do think that is one of the hardest nuts to crack, just that human behavior, that willingness to do something different, that ability to remember, like, oh, when I did it different for a week, like, that actually yielded some results. But I think that's, again, where sometimes you've got to put in some different economic incentives for different behavior to kind of nudge that along, and any number of other things that reduce the burdens, reduce the obstacles to people changing their behavior. It's really important.
And how do you decrease the demand for energy?
Well, I mean, there are any number of things. A big opportunity all round is efficiency, which has already enabled great gains to date. And there are continued opportunities for that. So that's a really big one. And then, there's also, again, opportunities to send people price signals around, if you run your washing machine at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, your electricity will cost this much. If you run your washing machine at 11 p.m. at night, when we've got an abundance of electricity on the system, and it's actually cheaper for us to generate the electricity, then we will price it lower as an incentive for you. So there are programs like that that can also be brought to bear to, again, just provide a nudge to behavior that reduces demand overall.
Let's see, you were talking about green jobs across the country, and I've always, these in Biden's plan, there will be jobs for skilled as well as unskilled workers, I assume.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's one of the benefits and the opportunities that, if we can find a way to retrain workers who are currently in the fossil fuel industry, they can transfer over. And you're right, it's all skill levels. One of the things that's actually happening is, as offshore wind takes off, what do you need to make offshore wind work? You need to be able to do really good drilling. You need to be able to do very good seabed assessment of various quantities. And so actually one of the groups of people who are very well poised to enter the industry are the people who've been doing oil drilling in the ocean for years or decades. And so there's a bit of a shift between those industries as people reapply their skills. So that's a relatively straightforward transition. I think we have to be candid around there are groups of people who have worked in the fossil fuel industry for decades, and when their jobs disappear, they can feel left high and dry. And that's an incredibly tough spot to be in, having worked hard all your life. So there are other places where we need to be more deliberate about offering people training opportunities, and that change can still be quite difficult. But there is opportunity there, and I think that's something we shouldn't lose sight of.
And is there anything going on in coal country?
There's always lots going on in coal country, right? So yeah.
To retrain these employees?
Yeah, I'll be honest, I'm not completely current on the specifics of that industry kind of down in West Virginia and that whole area. So that's something I probably can't really speak to authoritatively. But, certainly there are ways that whole communities can suddenly see a massive shift that's really quite complicated.
And I've got one last question about storage. How do you store, and where would you store great amounts of energy?
Yeah, I mean, so there are a variety of different approaches, and there are various different battery technologies. Right now, lithium ion is the dominant energy storage approach in the battery space, and there are other approaches that are being attempted as well. I think there's a slight sense of lithium ion is kind of the incumbent, and there's a question around, is that fine? Are developments in lithium ion going to enable us to meet the needs we have? Or is it really important to make sure we have other approaches too? It's a lot of different parameters around on what timescale can you store what amount of energy, and how does that compare to your grid? So that's kind of the dominant technology approach that a lot of the entrepreneurs are chasing as well. There are more conventional approaches. It's one of those things you can be talking about storing for incredibly short periods of time. You can be talking about storing over a whole season, and those longer timescales remain quite challenging now. But I think there's an appreciation that they can really getting storage that acts on that timescale could be tremendously beneficial as you look at the variation in demand overall.
And is there any waste that the batteries have?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things about all these technologies, right? You can build new batteries, you can build PV modules, solar modules. There's always a lot of different materials that goes into those kind of highly specialized systems. And, generally they last a really long time. So you're not dealing with the waste question very quickly, but at some point you are. And so that will absolutely be something that we'll need to grapple with, and will be part of the overall system management.
Well, I don't have any other questions, but thank you so much. This has been so interesting, and you've been just delightful to listen to, because you tell you're very excited about what you're studying and all these things that you're working on, and it's really contagious. And
Right.
It's a good contagion.
That's great. I love talking to my colleagues and to other experts, but I also think it's so important that everybody has some idea of some of the key issues. And so I am always happy to spread the word, and I hope it was in terms that people could follow and understand.
Yeah, and thank you so much for, really impressing upon us the importance of voting, because this is how, things happen or don't happen. If
Absolutely.
you don't vote, your voice and your vote are very important.
If
So.
we didn't learn that in 2016, I don't know when we will, but as I said, sometimes attention spans are short.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ashmore. This has been a real treat.
Thank you, Therese. I really enjoyed it.